in the rolling hills of a 12th-century English countryside, where mist clings to the grass in the earliest hours before sunrise, there lives a man named Edmund, 53 years old, with weathered hands scarred from decades of falconry. His story unfolds on a quiet autumn morning in the year 1187, as he tends to the birds he has spent his life learning to understand. Good evening and welcome. I am glad you are here. Our story tonight takes us to the Mews and meadows where Edmund moves through his daily work with the kind of steady grace that soothes the restless mind. Settle yourself comfortably. Let this story be a soft place to rest. The darkness before dawn carries its own particular peace. Edmund, 53 years old, stood in the Mews, the long stone building where his hawks rested on their perches and listened to the small sounds of the waking birds. His weathered hands, scarred from years of leather jesses and sharp talons, reached toward the first of the perches where his falcon, a merlin with feathers the color of burnished bronze, shifted slightly in the darkness. The air around him held the scent of hay and something else, something ancient and deep, that came only in autumn, the smell of the earth beginning to sleep. The falcon, her name was Aelred, turned her head toward him, and Edmund felt that familiar settling in his chest, the deep contentment that had never left him in 53 years of this work. He moved with no hurry, no sudden gesture. Everything in the Mews was done as it had always been done, measured and calm, the way a prayer is whispered rather than spoken. When his fingers found the leather hood soft from long use, worn smooth at the edges, he lifted it gently. The weight of it was nothing, barely more than a feather itself, but it represented the whole contract between the falcon and the man, the understanding that came from years of trust built moment by moment. He worked the hood over Aelred's head with the same care one might use to lay a sleeping child into a cradle. The falcon accepted this, as she always did, and Edmund felt his own breathing slow to match the rhythm of his hands. By the time he had finished with Aelred, the first birds were beginning to sing outside the Mews. Their voices came through the thick stone walls as if from a great distance, gentle, tentative, not yet the full chorus of day. Edmund moved to the next perch, where his older hawk, a goshawk named Thomas, waited with the patience that comes from age and understanding. Thomas was past his prime years for hunting, no longer swift enough to take the larger prey, but Edmund kept him as he kept all his birds, with honor, with presence, with the unhurried attention of a man who understood that every creature in his care was a teacher. Thomas's hood was thicker than Aelred's, heavier with age and use, and as Edmund settled it into place, his mind drifted to the seasons that had passed with this hawk autumn to spring to autumn again, the endless turning of the year, each cycle bringing its own small changes that only a man who paid attention would notice. The leather felt warm in his hands, warmed by the heat of the hawk's body. Everything in the Mews was warmer than the world outside, where the October air would soon begin to bite. The third hawk, a sparrow hawk named Michael, small and fierce, and young, required a different approach. Edmund waited several moments before reaching toward the perch, letting the hawk settle into the expectation of what would come. In his 53 years, Edmund had learned that patience was the deepest language, the one that all wild things understood. When he finally extended his hand, Michael stepped onto his leather-clad wrist with the ease of long repetition, and Edmund felt the tiny, sharp points of the talons through the protective leather, a sensation he had long ago stopped feeling as pain and had learned instead to feel as connection. The night was beginning to thin now. Not yet dawn, not yet that spilling of light across the fields, but the darkness had lost its absolute authority. Edmund could see the shapes of things more clearly: the posts where the perches hung, the stone walls with their irregular surfaces catching what little light remained, the wooden chest where he kept the hoods and jesses and all the small tools of his craft. He moved through the Mews as he had 1,000 times before, not thinking about the movements, simply allowing his hands to know what they had always known. When all the hawks had been hooded and transferred to their traveling perches, Edmund stood for a moment in the center of the Mews and breathed in the complex scent of the place leather and straw and something mineral from the stones, and underneath it all, the warm smell of the birds themselves. His scarred hands rested against his thighs, and he felt the weight of them there, solid and present. These hands had done this work for 40 years, since he was a boy of 13 in his father's Mews. 40 years of small, careful movements. 40 years of learning to read the moods of creatures that could never speak words. He stepped out of the Mews into the pre-dawn air, and the cold was a shock, a sharp and necessary thing that pulled him fully into the morning. The grass beneath his feet was damp with dew, and he could feel it even through his leather boots, moisture soaking in slowly, the earth releasing its night-gathered dampness as the day approached. In his arms, the hawks rode on their perches with the particular stillness of hooded birds, patient in their darkness, waiting for the moment when they would be released into the hunting light. The path from the Mews to the house ran along a low stone fence, and Edmund followed it with his eyes closed for several steps, knowing the way perfectly. He had walked this path in rain and in snow, in wind and in perfect stillness, and his feet knew every rise and fall of the ground. Around him, the landscape was beginning to reveal itself. He could see the shapes of the oak trees that stood scattered across his fields, ancient and dark against the lightening sky. He could hear the sound of running water from the small stream that ran through his land, the water cold and clear, moving always toward the distance. When he reached the house, he set the hawks carefully in the stone shed attached to its eastern side, a place prepared for them before each hunting day, with fresh water and the small comforts that made the waiting bearable. His wife, Aelred, 48 years old, would be stirring soon. She would hear him moving about and would know without asking that he was preparing for a day of hunting. They had been married for 27 years, and much had been learned in that long time about the language of presence, about how to be together without needing many words. Edmund's fingers, scarred and weathered from his 53 years and his decades of work, were already warming now from the small exertion of the morning. He moved into the house through the heavy wooden door, pulling it closed behind him with a soft sound. Inside, the air was warmer, and it carried the ghost scent of the bread that Aelred had baked the previous day. His deep contentment settled over him like a familiar cloak. Everything was as it should be: the hawks prepared, the morning arriving, the world moving through its eternal patterns. He could hear Aelred's footsteps in the room above, slow and deliberate as she began her own preparations for the day. Soon they would share a simple meal of bread and cheese and ale, and then the hunting would begin. Edmund descended the narrow wooden stairs, his scarred hands trailing along the wall worn smooth by decades of his own touch and his father's before him. The morning light was beginning to filter through the small windows now, turning the gray stone a shade of pale amber. Aelred was in the kitchen, her movements efficient and practiced, tending to the fire that would warm their simple breakfast. The scent of bread and something herbal she had hung dried herbs from the rafters for the winter ahead filled the space between them. "The hawks are ready," he said, his voice low and steady, the way he spoke to all things. Aelred, 48 years old, with her capable hands and her hair the color of faded bronze, glanced toward him and smiled without needing more explanation. She had lived with his falconry long enough to understand that these words contained everything. The birds were calm, the weather was favorable, the day held promise. She set before him a wooden bowl of pottage barley and onions and herbs simmered together through the night, and a piece of bread still warm from yesterday's baking. Edmund ate slowly, the way he did all things, tasting each spoonful. The warmth of the food moved through him, settling into his chest, and he felt the particular gratitude that comes only when one is truly present for small things. Outside, the sky continued its transformation from dark gray to something lighter, softer. "Thomas seemed restless last night," Aelred said, pouring ale into a clay cup. She meant the older goshawk, and Edmund nodded. "The weather is turning. He always knows before we do." Edmund, 53 years old, considered this. It was true the hawks sensed the shift in the air, the way the world was beginning to prepare itself for winter's deeper cold. "He'll hunt well today," he said. "Age hasn't taken that from him." They sat together in the warming kitchen, not speaking much, but the silence between them was full rather than empty. This too was something Edmund had learned across his 53 years, that presence could be a gift even without words. Aelred's hands moved as she worked, preparing strips of dried meat to take with them to the fields, and Edmund watched the familiar precision of her movements. She had sewn his leather gauntlets countless times, had cleaned and repaired the jesses, and had learned to recognize the temperament of each bird simply by watching how Edmund approached them. When the meal was finished, Edmund stood and moved to the corner where his hunting gear waited. His falcon cloak, the heavy woolen garment, dyed a deep brown, stained with the evidence of years of use, hung from a wooden peg. He drew it around his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle across him. This cloak had cost him dearly when he was younger, before he had become skilled enough to earn good money from his falconry. Now it was a second skin, comfortable and necessary. Aelred handed him a leather pouch containing the meat he would use to reward the hawks when they made their kills. The pouch had belonged to his father before him, and the leather had taken on a particular smoothness from all the hands that had held it, all the times it had been opened and closed in moments of success or patience or quiet disappointment. Edmund accepted it with a nod of thanks and secured it at his waist. The morning had fully arrived now, the sun still below the horizon but making its intentions clear through the sky. Edmund, 53 years old, stepped back out into the air with Aelred following. They walked together toward the stone shed where the hawks waited, their breath making small clouds in the cool morning. The grass was beginning to dry, though moisture still clung to the lower parts of the plants, and Edmund could hear the stream more clearly now, its voice carrying across the quiet landscape. In the shed, the hawks were still and calm on their perches. Edmund approached them with the same unhurried attention he brought to all his work, speaking to each bird in a voice barely above a whisper, not words so much as sounds, tones that the hawks had learned to recognize over months and years. Michael, the young sparrow hawk, was the most eager, his whole body seeming to vibrate with the desire to hunt. Aelred, the merlin, was calm and focused, ready for the work of the day. Thomas, the older goshawk, waited with the patience that only came from having hunted hundreds of times before. Edmund transferred Michael first to his gloved wrist, feeling the familiar pressure of the talons through the leather. Then, with Aelenor's help, she held the perch steady while he collected the other two hawks. The weight of them on his wrist and shoulder was substantial but not burdensome. These were his companions, creatures he understood as deeply as any human in his life, and they understood him in return through the language of consistency and care. The walk to the hunting fields took them along a path that Edmund could have traveled blindfolded. It ran between low stone walls, past a small shrine where someone had left flowers dried now, from an earlier season, in through a wooden gate that required a particular trick to open, a lifting and turning that Edmund's hands performed without conscious thought. On either side of the path, the fields spread out in gentle undulation, and beyond them the forest began, ancient oaks and ash trees standing like guardians of time itself. Aelred walked beside him, and occasionally she would point out something, a bird in flight, a particularly beautiful arrangement of clouds, the way the light was touching the distant hills. Edmund noticed these things as well, but he had learned long ago that the true beauty was not in the observing but in the quality of attention brought to the observing. This was something his father had taught him, though not in words. This was something that lived in the bones of all falconers, that understanding that the world revealed itself only to those who came to it with patience and presence. By the time they reached the primary hunting field, a stretch of open grassland bordered by scattered trees and low brush, the sun had begun its climb above the horizon. The light was still soft, still golden rather than the harsh brightness it would become later in the day, and Edmund knew that this was when the hawks hunted best. The prey was moving, motivated by hunger as the day began, and the hawks were fresh and alert. Edmund, 53 years old, began the familiar ritual of the release. He walked to the center of the field, where the ground was open and the sight lines were clear. Here, he would wait, and here, the hawks would find their food. He raised his wrist, where Michael still perched, and spoke to the young sparrow hawk in that low, almost inaudible voice. He could feel the bird's attention intensify, feel the readiness in the muscles and bones of the small creature balanced on his gloved hand. Then, in one smooth motion, he raised his arm and opened his hand, and Michael launched himself into the morning air. The sparrow hawk rose quickly, his wings catching the slanting light, his whole being focused on the hunt. Edmund watched him climb, his scarred hands shielding his eyes against the brightness, and felt that deep settling that always came when a hawk took to the air. This was the purpose, the moment when all the care and training and patience transformed into something purely alive and wild. Aelred stood beside him, and he could feel her own attention following the hawk upward. She had learned to read the sky as the hawks did, to sense the prey moving through the brush, to understand the invisible currents of the hunt. They stood together in silence, and the morning pressed around them, the sound of the wind through the distant trees, the subtle movements of the grass, the call of other birds who recognized the danger in their midst. It was not long before Michael made his first strike. Edmund saw the sudden dive, the swift descent, and then the small shape of the prey, a field vole, quick and desperate, attempting its escape. But the young sparrow hawk was faster, more focused, more committed. The strike was swift and clean, and within moments Michael had his kill, a small triumph that would sustain him through the morning. Edmund approached slowly, not hurrying, his weathered hands ready with the leather pouch Aelred had given him. When he reached the hawk, Michael stepped onto his wrist with the kill still clutched in his talons, and Edmund rewarded him with a piece of the dried meat. This was the exchange. The understanding between hunter and man. The hawk brought his skill, his speed, his wild knowledge, and Edmund brought food and care and the shelter of his attention. "Well done," Edmund murmured to the hawk, and though Michael could not understand the words, the tone was clear, was recognition and gratitude and the quiet acknowledgement of work done well. As the morning deepened, Edmund released the other hawks in turn. Aelred, the merlin, took 2 small birds that flushed from the brush with desperate speed, only to meet the falcon's superior skill. Thomas, the older goshawk, moved more slowly but with an accuracy born of 40 years of hunting. He took a young rabbit, a larger prey that required the full force of his experience to bring down. By midday, all 3 hawks had fed well, and Edmund had begun to gather them back to his wrist and shoulder. The work was never rushed. Each hawk was brought in with the same unhurried attention that had guided the morning from its beginning. Aelred had brought food for them as well, bread and cheese, and the last of the apples from the previous day's storage, and they sat together on a low stone wall at the edge of the field, looking out across the landscape they had hunted all their lives. "Your father would be pleased," Aelred said, her capable hands breaking bread into smaller pieces. She had known Edmund's father, had heard his stories about the training of hawks, about the patience required to bring wild creatures to trust a human hand. Edmund, 53 years old, nodded slowly. His father had died when Edmund was 41, and the old man had spent his final years teaching everything he knew to his son, not through formal instruction, but through presence, through example, through the kind of attention that transforms both teacher and student. "He would say the hawks are doing their work," Edmund replied. "That is all that matters." The afternoon light was different from the morning light, heavier, more solid, the shadows cast by the scattered trees growing longer as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Edmund knew that soon they would begin the journey back toward home, back toward the Mews where the hawks would rest and recover before the evening routines. But for now, he allowed himself to simply sit, to feel the weight of the hawks on his arms and shoulder, to taste the bread and cheese, to hear the sound of Aelred breathing beside him and the wind moving through the grass. A hawk called in the distance, not one of his own, but another falcon, perhaps a wild one passing through on a journey toward distant lands. Edmund listened to the cry with a particular attention, and he found himself wondering, as he had wondered many times in his 53 years, about the nature of freedom. Were the hawks that hunted at his wrist truly captive, or had they chosen, in some way he could never fully understand, to return to his hand each time? Was the exchange they had made truly confinement, or was it something else entirely, a different kind of freedom, one that came from trust and from the security of being known? These were questions he would never answer, and he had long ago stopped trying to answer them. Instead, he sat with them, the way he sat with all the mysteries that his work had taught him to recognize and honor. This patience, this willingness to hold the unknowable, was perhaps the truest education the hawks had given him. As the afternoon began its slow descent toward evening, Edmund gathered the hawks with movements so practiced they had become almost meditative. Michael, the young sparrow hawk, stepped onto his leather-clad wrist with the eagerness of youth satisfied by a successful hunt. Aelred, the merlin with her bronze-colored feathers, settled onto his shoulder with the composed dignity that came from experience. Thomas, the older goshawk, required a moment of patient Edmund waiting with his arm extended, his scarred hands steady, until the aging hawk decided of his own accord to step up onto the perch Edmund held ready. Aelred gathered the leather pouch, now empty of its rewards and the cloth that had held their meal. They began the walk back toward home, moving at a pace that honored the hawk's need for rest and the day's quiet completion. The path beneath their feet was the same one they had traveled that morning, but the light had transformed it into something different. Where the morning had brought clarity and golden brightness, the afternoon offered something more muted, more contemplative, the sun lower in the sky now, casting everything in shades of amber and deep gold. "Look there," Aelred said softly, pointing with her free hand toward the distant forest. A deer had emerged from the tree line, moving across the open field with that particular grace that comes only to creatures who know themselves to be always observed by predators. Edmund watched the animal's movement, noting the alertness in its bearing, the way its ears moved to track sounds beyond human hearing. The hawks on his arms and shoulders remained calm, their interest caught but not triggered. They were fed, satisfied, and the work of the day was complete. The deer moved through the grass with unhurried steps, and Edmund found himself grateful for the moment. These sightings, these small meetings with wild things that asked nothing of him but to acknowledge their presence, had become a kind of punctuation mark in his life. His father had taught him to value these moments as much as the moments of the hunt itself, to understand that witnessing was its own form of prayer. By the time they reached the small shrine on the path home, the light had begun to change in earnest. The sun was still visible above the western hills, but its angle was becoming steeper, and the shadows of the trees had stretched themselves into long, dark fingers across the ground. Aelred paused at the shrine, as she often did on their return from hunting, and placed a small flower that she had been carrying, a late aster, blue-purple and delicate among the offerings left by others. Edmund waited, his hawks quiet on his arms and shoulder. He understood without words what this gesture meant. Aelred's mother had died in childbirth when Aelred herself was only 9 years old, and the shrine was dedicated to the protection of women in that most dangerous time. Aelred had made this offering nearly every week for 27 years, a continuation of the prayers that had come too late to save her own mother, but that might, she believed, protect others from similar sorrow. The stones of the shrine were ancient, smoothed by countless hands over centuries. Edmund had learned from his father that such places held memory, that the very stones absorbed something of the devotion that was brought to them. Whether this was true or merely the kind of poetic thinking that came naturally to those who spent their lives with wild creatures, he could not say. But he honored Aelred's belief the way he honored all sincere things, with presence and with respect. They continued on as the light continued its daily work of transformation. The path ran now through a section where the forest pressed closer, ancient oak trees standing on either side like witnesses to all the journeys that had passed this way. Edmund, 53 years old, breathed in the scent of the forest earth and growing things, and the particular smell that came only in autumn, when the year was beginning to fold in on itself, preparing for the cold months ahead. As they walked, Edmund began to hum very softly a plain chant melody that he had heard many years ago from a monk who had stayed for a season at the manor house. The melody had lodged itself in his memory, and it emerged now without conscious intention, something his body had learned to do as naturally as breathing. It was a melody about peace, about the quieting of the troubled mind, about the gentle approach of rest. Aelred listened without comment, and Edmund felt her presence beside him as a kind of completion to the day. The Mews came into view as they rounded the final bend in the path. The stone building was catching the last of the direct sunlight, its walls glowing with a warmth that seemed to emanate from within. This was home, not just the physical structure, though that mattered, but the entire space that Edmund had created around his work, the environment that allowed the hawks to rest and recover and be ready for the next day's hunting. Edmund approached the first of the perches with Thomas still balanced on his shoulder. The older goshawk stepped off without hesitation, his talons gripping the wooden perch with the certainty of long repetition. Edmund adjusted the leather straps that connected the hawk to the perch with fingers that could perform this task in near total darkness. These small movements had been refined over decades until they required no conscious thought whatsoever. Aelred came next, the merlin settling onto her own perch with a slight ruffling of feathers that indicated her satisfaction with the day. Michael, the youngest and most energetic, required a moment more of attention, but soon all three hawks were secure and at ease, the day's work behind them. Aelred appeared at Edmund's side with a bucket of fresh water, drawn that morning from the well. She had already prepared it while Edmund was finalizing the hawks' positions, knowing without needing to be told what would be required. Together, they moved from perch to perch, offering each hawk the opportunity to drink and to bathe if it wished. Thomas accepted the water gratefully, dipping his beak and tilting his head back in the way of birds, allowing the water to run down his throat. Aelred was more fastidious, using the water to clean her feathers, her movements precise and deliberate. The youngest one's getting proud of himself, Aelred observed, watching Michael preen with the exaggerated movements of a bird, still learning the full extent of his own abilities. Edmund nodded, his scarred hands beginning to gather the equipment that would need to be cleaned and stored. The leather of the jesses, if not cared for properly, would dry and crack, becoming brittle and unreliable. The perches themselves needed regular inspection for any signs of wear that might compromise the hawk's safety. As the sun continued its descent, Edmund moved through these tasks with the same unhurried attention that governed all his work. He oiled the leather carefully, working the substance in with his fingertips, feeling the grain of the material respond to his touch. His hands had performed this exact motion thousands of times, and they moved with a kind of wisdom that lived in the muscles and bones themselves, a wisdom that had nothing to do with conscious thought. Aelred busied herself with preparing the evening meal. The kitchen fire, banked that morning, had been allowed to die down, and she began the work of bringing it back to life, arranging kindling, adding larger pieces of wood, coaxing the flames upward with patient breath. The scent of wood smoke began to drift through the small house, mixing with the smell of dried herbs and the underlying smell of home, itself a combination of earth and stone, and all the small accumulated evidence of a life lived carefully and well. By the time Edmund had finished with his work, the light outside had faded almost completely. The sky still held a thin line of gold on the western horizon, but above that, the blue had deepened to purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Edmund, 53 years old, stood for a moment in the doorway of the Mews and looked up at this transformation, feeling the particular gratitude that came only at the end of a day spent in work that honored both the wild and the domestic. He moved toward the house, where Aelred would have the evening meal ready. The walk was only a few dozen steps, but Edmund took it slowly, allowing his body to transition from the alertness required for the day's work to the ease that came with evening and rest. His scarred hands, which had been engaged in precise, careful movements all day, began to relax, the muscles releasing their particular tension. Inside, the kitchen was warm and bright with a firelight. Aelred had prepared a pottage, vegetables, and barley simmered with herbs, a meal that required little effort to eat but provided substantial nourishment. There was bread as well, and a small portion of cheese and ale to drink. They sat together at the wooden table, the surface worn smooth by years and years of use, and Edmund ate slowly, tasting each element of the meal. "The hawks will rest well tonight," Aelred said, more of an observation than a question. Edmund nodded, his mouth full of bread. It was true the day had been good for them, the hunting successful, and now they would roost through the night, their bodies recovering, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. As they ate, Aelred told him a small story, something that had happened in the village that day while Edmund had been hunting. One of the village children had gotten his hand stuck in a fence, and it had taken 3 adults to carefully widen the opening enough to free him. The boy had emerged unharmed, though frightened, and the incident had become the subject of much discussion and general agreement about the importance of being mindful of such dangers. Edmund listened to the story, and it struck him, as these village stories often did, how different the world of human concerns was from the world of the hawks. The hawks did not worry about fences or getting stuck. They moved through their days with a kind of perfect presence, responding to what was immediately in front of them without anxiety about future complications. And yet, Edmund had learned over his 53 years, humans needed this kind of presence as well. The anxiety about what might happen often caused more suffering than the actual occurrence of the feared event. When the meal was finished, Aelred cleared the table and began the work of washing the wooden bowls in water she had heated over the fire. Edmund moved to the small window and looked out at the darkening landscape. The Mews was now invisible in the gathering darkness, but he could sense the hawks there, settling into their night roosts, finding the positions they preferred for sleep. This knowledge was a comfort to him to know that all was well with the creatures in his care, that they were safe and secure, and at rest. Aelred finished her work and came to stand beside him at the window. Without speaking, she reached over and took his hand, the scarred, weathered hand of a man who had spent his life in careful service to wild creatures. He squeezed her fingers gently, and they stood together as full darkness descended, watching the night world reveal itself in the form of stars and the silver light of the emerging moon. "Come," Aelred said finally, tugging gently at his hand. "You'll need rest if you're to be out again at dawn." Edmund allowed himself to be led toward the stairs. The climb was familiar, his feet knowing exactly where to place themselves in the darkness. The bedchamber was cool, the night air coming through the small shuttered window carrying with it the scent of the autumn fields. Aelred was already beginning to prepare for sleep, removing her outer garments and reaching for the simple linen shift she wore for sleeping. Edmund moved through his own preparations with the same unhurried attention that characterized all his movements. His 53-year-old body had begun, in recent years, to require more time to settle into rest, a stiffness in the joints that came from decades of early mornings and precise, repetitive movements. But he had learned not to fight this, only to honor it with patience, to allow his body to find its own rhythms. When at last they lay in the bed together, Aelred already drifting toward sleep beside him, Edmund found himself in that particular state that sometimes came in the hours just before true sleep arrived, a state where thought seemed to move slowly, like honey pouring, and the world seemed to consist primarily of sensation and memory. He thought of his father, dead now for 12 years. He thought of the first hawk he had ever trained, a goshawk named Gabriel, who had lived for 32 years, an astonishing span for a wild creature, even one in captivity. He thought of Aelred's mother, whom he had never met but whose loss had shaped the woman lying beside him, who had taught her something about the precariousness of human existence that manifested in her consistent kindness and her daily offerings at the shrine. Most of all, he thought of the hawksmichael with his youthful vigor, Aelred with her composed competence, and Thomas with his aged wisdom. They were, in some way that Edmund could never quite articulate, his teachers. They had taught him about presence, about the value of attention, about the way that care and consistency could create a kind of peace that was available to any creature willing to slow down enough to notice it. As sleep began to pull him under, Edmund felt Aelred's breathing beside him, slow and deep and regular. The night pressed around them, the ancient stones of the house holding the warmth of the day, and somewhere in the darkness, the hawks roosted peacefully, waiting for the dawn that would bring another day of hunting, another opportunity to move through the work that had defined Edmund's entire life. The last conscious thought that passed through Edmund's mind before sleep claimed him entirely was one of profound gratitude, not gratitude for any particular thing, but gratitude for the simple fact of existence itself, for the privilege of being alive and awake and present to the world in all its quiet complexity. The night deepened around the small stone house, the kind of darkness that comes only in autumn when the days have grown noticeably shorter, and the world seems to be settling itself into longer periods of rest. Edmund slept the sleep of a man whose body had spent itself in honest work, a sleep without dreams or restlessness, the kind of sleep that replenishes something deeper than mere physical exhaustion. He woke before dawn, as he always did, the rhythm of his life so established that his body no longer required the summoning of bells or the voices of others. For a moment, he lay still in the darkness, feeling Aelred's warmth beside him, listening to the particular silence that came only in these hours before the world truly woke. His scarred hands rested on the woolen blanket that covered them both, and he felt a kind of peace settle through his chest, the deep contentment that had always characterized his emotional baseline, even in times of difficulty or loss. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended, but the sound was familiar, almost musical to his ears. Aelred would not wake for another hour or more. She had learned long ago that the hours before dawn were Edmund's alone, a time when he could move through his preparations without disturbing her rest. This arrangement had been born not of any spoken agreement, but of simple observation and adaptation, the way that two people who have lived together for 27 years learn to honor each other's needs without requiring explanation. The kitchen fire had been banked the night before, and Edmund worked to bring it back to life with the same methodical approach he brought to all tasks. He arranged kindling in the center of the ashes, found the small piece of smoldering charcoal that Aelred always preserved for this purpose, and blew gently, coaxing the flames upward. The wood caught quickly, and soon the fire was burning with steady purpose, filling the space with warmth and light. As he waited for water to heat for his morning drink, a simple tisane made from herbs Aelred had dried the previous summer, Edmund stood at the window and looked out at the landscape that was just beginning to reveal itself in the pre-dawn gray. The fields were invisible still, hidden beneath layers of darkness, but he could sense them there, sleeping under their blanket of dew and mist. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called, announcing the approaching day to any creature that cared to listen. Edmund, 53 years old, hummed softly as he worked the same plain chant melody that had emerged unbidden the previous afternoon, the one about peace and the quieting of troubled minds. His hands moved through the familiar routines, setting out a clay cup, adding the dried herbs to a small ceramic pot, pouring the now steaming water over them. The scent rose with the steam, complex and herbal, carrying within it the memory of summer warmth and the particular essence of the plants Aelred tended in her small garden. By the time he had finished his drink, the sky had begun its transformation from deep gray to something lighter, something that promised the arrival of day. Edmund felt the familiar stirring of anticipation that came with every dawn, not excitement, which would have violated the peaceful baseline that characterized his 53 years, but rather a gentle readiness, a kind of openness to whatever the day might bring. He moved toward the door, pulling on the heavy woolen cloak that had hung there since the previous evening, still carrying within its folds the scent of the fields and the hawks. The leather gauntlets went on next, old friends that his hands recognized immediately, molding to his palms with the ease of perfect familiarity. The walk to the Mews was made in near total darkness still, but Edmund's feet knew the path as well as they knew the layout of his own bed. He moved carefully but without hesitation, his mind already beginning to shift into the particular awareness that falconry required a state of alert attention combined with complete patience, a paradox that only those who had trained hawks over many years could truly understand. The Mews was darker still, the stone building blocking what little light had begun to appear in the sky. Edmund stood for a moment in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust, listening to the small movements of the hawks as they began to stir with the approach of dawn. This was his favorite time, this moment before the full light came, when the hawks were beginning to wake, but had not yet fully emerged into the alertness of day. "Good morning," he said softly to the darkness, to the hawks and to the Mews itself and to the world in general. His voice was barely louder than a whisper, but it carried the weight of intention, the quality of attention that all creatures recognized as genuine. "Another day has come. Let us be grateful for it." He approached Thomas's perch first, the older goshawk shifting slightly as Edmund drew near. The hawk's eyes opened fully, dark and intelligent, and Edmund felt that familiar moment of connection, the sense that in some wordless way, an understanding passed between them. This was what his father had taught him to value above all else. Not the mastery of the hawk, not even the successful hunt, but this moment of genuine meeting between two creatures, the human and the wild thing, each acknowledging the presence of the other. "You're ready, old friend," Edmund said, his scarred hands beginning the work of preparing Thomas for the day. The leather jesses were checked for any sign of wear, the perch was inspected, and fresh water was offered in a shallow ceramic bowl. Thomas accepted the water gratefully, his movements reflecting the particular dignity that age had granted him. Edmund had trained hawks since he was 13 years old, and in all those years, he had never ceased to be moved by the grace with which creatures accepted care. Aelred was next, the merlin alert and focused, her bronze-colored feathers already catching what little light had begun to penetrate the Mews. She was a younger bird than Thomas, perhaps 8 years old, and she carried herself with a composed readiness that spoke to her experience of many successful hunts. Edmund had trained her himself over the course of 2 long seasons, and the bond between them was one of mutual respect earned through countless small interactions, each one a demonstration of reliability and care. Michael, the youngest, was already preening, his small frame vibrating with an almost barely contained energy. Edmund smiled slightly at the sight of him, this young hawk who had taken to hunting so naturally, who seemed to understand instinctively what the older birds had to learn through months of patient training. There was something endearing about youth, Edmund reflected, the way it moved through the world with a kind of innocent confidence, not yet weighted by the accumulated awareness that came with age. By the time Edmund had finished his preparations with all 3 hawks, the sky had brightened considerably. The gray had given way to a kind of pale blue-gray, and the shapes of individual trees were becoming visible against the lightening horizon. It would be perhaps another hour before the sun actually broke above the eastern hills, but the day was clearly coming, inevitable and unstoppable as the seasons themselves. Aelred appeared in the doorway of the Mews, still in her sleeping shift, her capable hands carrying a package of food wrapped in cloth. She had known, without needing to be told, that Edmund would want to extend the hunting day, to take advantage of what looked to be clear weather and good conditions. She handed him the bundle bread and dried meat, and a small piece of cheese, and he accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thomas," she asked, her eyes moving to the older goshawk. "Ready," Edmund confirmed. "All of them are ready." Alina reached out and placed her hand on his arm for a moment, a gesture that contained everything that 27 years of marriage had taught them to communicate without words. Then she turned and moved back toward the house, leaving Edmund to his work. The journey to the hunting fields was the same as it had been the previous day, but the quality of light made it feel like an entirely different landscape. Where the previous day had brought the golden clarity of mid-autumn, this dawn brought something softer, more muted, the light still distant and tentative, as if the sun itself had not yet fully committed to the day's arrival. Edmund walked at a leisurely pace, allowing the hawks time to adjust to their perches on his arms and shoulder. Michael moved restlessly, eager to be released, but Edmund held him steady with the quiet firmness that the young hawk had learned to accept. "Patience," he murmured, though whether he was speaking to the hawk or to himself was unclear. "The day will come. There is no need to rush toward it." By the time Edmund reached the primary hunting field, the first direct rays of sunlight had begun to touch the tops of the distant trees. The light was warm and encouraging, carrying with it a promise of good hunting weather. Edmund set up in his usual location, a piece of elevated ground that gave him a clear view of the surrounding fields and brush where prey was likely to move. He stood for a moment, his scarred hands steady, his 53-year-old body settled into the particular stance that falconry required, alert but not tense, ready but not anxious. This balance was something his father had spent years teaching him to understand, and it remained one of the most valuable lessons of his life. That true effectiveness came not from straining or pushing, but from a kind of relaxed readiness, a state of being fully present without being gripped by the need for specific outcomes. Then, as the sun continued its climb above the horizon, Edmund released Michael into the morning light. The young sparrow hawk rose swiftly, his wings catching the golden light, his entire being focused on the hunt ahead. Edmund watched him climb, his eyes tracking the bird's movement with the kind of attention that could follow a creature across vast distances of sky. There was a particular beauty in this moment, the hawk fully alive and wild, doing exactly what he had been created to do, and Edmund bearing witness to this expression of perfect purpose. The day that followed was one of those rare days when everything seemed to flow with natural ease. The hawks found prey readily. Their strikes were clean and successful, and Edmund found himself in a state of profound peace that transcended the simple pleasure of a successful hunt. He was part of something larger than himself, part of a chain of being that connected the smallest field mouse to the largest predator, part of a cycle that had been turning since the beginning of time. By midday, all three hawks had fed well, and Edmund began the process of gathering them back to his wrist and shoulder. As he worked, he found himself thinking about time itself, about how strange it was that the same hands that had prepared hawks as a boy of 13 were still preparing hawks in his 53rd year. and would, if fortune allowed, continue to do so for years to come. It was a strange form of constancy, this repetition of the same actions across decades, and yet it was also deeply comforting, a kind of anchor in a world that changed constantly in so many other ways. The walk back toward home took them through the village itself this time, rather than along the more direct path through the fields. Edmund had chosen this route deliberately, wanting to see how the human world had moved through the day while he had been occupied with his hawks. The village was busy with the ordinary work of people, a woman hanging laundry to dry, a man repairing a wooden fence, children playing with a kind of unself-conscious joy in the dust of the main pathway. One of the children, a boy perhaps 6 or 7 years old, spotted Edmund and his hawks and came running toward him with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that only very young children possessed. "Is that one going to hunt us?" the boy asked, pointing at Thomas, the older goshawk. Edmund, 53 years old, felt a smile emerge from somewhere deep inside him. "No," he said gently. "These hawks have already eaten. They're resting now, the way you rest after you've run and played." The boy seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to his game, but the interaction lingered with Edmund as he continued through the village. There was something in the boy's question that contained a kind of fundamental human fear, the recognition that wild things could be dangerous, that the natural world operated by rules different from human society. And yet, Edmund had found over 53 years of living that this danger was often overstated, that most wild creatures simply wanted to be left alone to pursue their own existence. By the time Edmund and the hawks reached the Mews again, the afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening. The sun was lower now, the shadows longer, and there was a quality to the light that suggested the day was beginning its slow descent toward rest. Aelred appeared at the kitchen window as he approached, and he could see her smile at the sight of him, the satisfaction that came from knowing that another day had passed safely, successfully, without incident or alarm. The evening routines followed the patterns that had been established over years, and years, the hawks being secured on their perches, fresh water offered, the leather equipment cleaned and oiled. Edmund moved through these tasks with the automatic competence that comes only from thousands of repetitions, his hands and mind working together so seamlessly that there was no separation between thought and action. As dusk gathered around the Mews, Edmund stood for a moment in the doorway and looked out at the landscape that was preparing itself for night. Somewhere in the distance, a bell was ringing the call to evening prayers from the small church in the village. The sound carried across the fields, reaching Edmund where he stood with his hawks secure around him, and he felt a kind of recognition in the sound. This, too, was a kind of falconry. He thought the human attempt to train the mind and spirit to respond to certain calls, certain signals, the way hawks responded to the voice and presence of their trainer. The night that followed was quiet and peaceful, filled with the simple rhythms that had characterized Edmund's life for more than 5 decades. Aelred prepared their evening meal. They ate together at the worn wooden table. They moved through the house in that comfortable silence that comes only to those who have lived together long enough to understand that not all communication requires words. And when at last Edmund lay in the darkness of the bedchamber, Aelred breathing softly beside him. He found himself in that particular state of gratitude that had become so much a part of his emotional baseline that he almost forgot to notice it. This gratitude was not for any specific thing, not for a successful hunt, or good weather, or the love of his wife, though he was grateful for all of these things. Rather, it was a gratitude for the simple fact of being alive, of being present, of being able to bring his full attention to the small and precious details that filled each day. Sleep came easily to Edmund, 53 years old, a man who had learned over the course of half a century that the most profound peace came not from seeking great things, but from honoring the sacred in the small things. In the way, a hawk stepped onto a gloved wrist, in the scent of herbs heating in hot water, in the presence of a woman beside him in the darkness, in the particular quality of light that came only at dawn. The days began to follow a pattern that was both reassuring in its consistency and subtly different in its details. The way that autumn itself moved, each day recognizable as autumn, yet distinctly its own season within the larger season. Edmund, 53 years old, found himself settling deeper into a rhythm that had defined his entire life, and yet each morning brought with it a kind of freshness, as if he were experiencing the work of falconry for the first time. It was on the 5th day after that first morning when Aelred had noticed something shift in Edmund's approach to his work. She mentioned it as they prepared the evening meal, her capable hands moving through the familiar motions of tending the fire and arranging the vegetables that would go into the pottage. "You're humming more," she observed, not as a criticism but as a simple statement of fact. "The melody from the monk's time with us. You've been humming it almost all day." Edmund, his scarred hands busy with the work of oiling the leather jesses, paused and considered this. It was true the plain chant melody had taken on a life of its own, emerging unbidden at moments throughout the day, accompanying his work the way that birdsong accompanied the outdoor world. "Does it disturb you?" he asked. "No," Aelred replied, her 48-year-old face softening with something that might have been nostalgia. "It reminds me that you're at peace. I've known you long enough to understand that when you hum that particular melody, something in the day has aligned itself properly." This observation struck Edmund with a kind of quiet recognition. It was true that the humming emerged only in certain states of mind: when the hawks were hunting well, when the weather was favorable, when everything seemed to be moving in concert with itself, rather than against some imagined resistance. His father had done something similar. Edmund recalled had hummed different melodies depending on his mood and the day's conditions. It was a kind of language, Edmund realized, a way of communicating one's internal state without needing to resort to words. The following morning arrived gray and cool, with a quality of air that suggested rain was approaching. Edmund stood at the window of the Mews and assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 53 years reading the weather and understanding its implications for hunting. The hawks would still hunt in light rain, but they would be less enthusiastic, less willing to venture far from cover. The day would be shorter, more constrained, requiring more patience than the recent clear days had demanded. "The rain is coming," Edmund said to no one in particular, though Thomas seemed to listen with particular attention. The older goshawk had likely sensed the barometric pressure change long before Edmund had noticed it consciously. This was another of the lessons that the hawks had taught him over the years. The understanding that wild creatures possessed forms of knowledge that human senses could only partially access. He released Michael first, as he often did, the young sparrow hawk launching himself into the gray morning with an eagerness that suggested he understood, in his own way, that the hunting window would be narrower today. The hawk climbed quickly, his wings cutting through the heavy air with determined strokes, and Edmund watched his progress with the kind of attention that never wavered, regardless of how many times he had performed this action. The first drops of rain began to fall just as Michael made his first strike. A small finch flushed from the brush, desperate and quick, but not quick enough. The rain intensified slightly, coming in sheets now rather than individual drops, and Edmund felt the water beginning to run down the sides of his face, soaking into his wool cloak. But there was no discomfort in this. Rather, there was a kind of satisfaction in the way that the weather simply was what it was, neither good nor bad, but simply present and real. By the time Edmund had released Aelred and Thomas, the rain had reached the point where visibility was becoming genuinely difficult. The merlin and the older goshawk both seemed to understand the constraints of the day, moving with a kind of focused efficiency that suggested they were hunting not for pleasure or sport, but out of genuine necessity. This was the reality of wild creatures. Edmund reflected they did not have the luxury of choosing whether conditions were favorable. They simply hunted when hunting was possible, rested when rest was necessary, and adapted to whatever circumstances presented themselves. Aelred appeared at some point during the morning, bringing with her a wool cloak for Edmund, and standing for a time beside him, watching the rain and the hawks and the gray landscape all together. The two of them stood in companionable silence, water running down both their faces now, neither of them seeming particularly bothered by the soaking that was occurring. There was something about standing in bad weather together that created a particular kind of closeness, a shared acknowledgement that some things simply could not be controlled or changed, and that the appropriate response was acceptance rather than complaint. "Your father used to stand in the rain like this," Aelred said after some time. "I remember once, years before we were married, I saw him standing in a downpour exactly as you're standing now. He looked completely at peace, as if the rain was exactly what he had been waiting for." Edmund felt something shift inside him at this memory, a kind of recognition that he was continuing something that extended backward through time, that his father had done this work before him, and his father's father before that, in an unbroken line of men who had chosen to dedicate their lives to the training of hawks. "What happened to the hawks that day?" he asked. "They hunted," Aelred said simply. "Less successfully than on clear days, perhaps, but they hunted nonetheless. Your father seemed to think that the rain was good for them in some way, that it kept them sharp, prevented them from becoming complacent." This observation stayed with Edmund as the day progressed. The rain continued, steady and patient, and the hawks continued to hunt, and Edmund continued to stand in the weather, his scarred hands steady, his 53-year-old body settled into the acceptance that came only from long practice. By the time the afternoon began to turn toward evening, all three hawks had made successful kills, and Edmund found himself in a state of particular contentment, not the exuberant satisfaction that sometimes came from an exceptionally good day, but rather a quiet recognition that life was moving as it should, that the hawks were doing their work, and that he was doing his. The walk back to the Mews was made almost entirely in darkness. The day had ended early, curtailed by the heavy cloud cover and the persistent rain. Aelred walked beside him, and their conversation shifted to practical matters. The need to repair a section of fence before the winter came, the question of whether there would be enough stores of food to last through the cold months, the possibility that one of the village women was expecting a child and might need assistance. These conversations were the texture of their shared life. Edmund realized not the dramatic moments or the emotional peaks, but these steady, practical discussions about how to maintain a household, how to prepare for the future, how to be good neighbors and members of a community. His father had engaged in similar conversations with Edmund's mother, Edmund recalled, and there had been something deeply satisfying about the way that two people could work together toward common goals without needing constant reassurance or emotional validation. The Mews appeared out of the rain and darkness like a refuge, its stone walls offering shelter and permanence. Edmund secured the hawks on their perches with movements made almost entirely by feel and memory, his hands knowing exactly where each piece of equipment needed to be placed. The leather work would need to be cleaned particularly carefully tonight. He noted mentally the rain would have done none of it any good, and leaving it damp would invite the kind of deterioration that could eventually render the equipment unusable. Inside the house, Aelred had prepared a particularly warming meal, a hearty pottage with more vegetables than usual, bread, and a small portion of mutton that must have been set aside specifically for this rainy day. There was warmth in the kitchen from the fire, and Edmund felt his body beginning to relax into the comfort of the interior space. The contrast between the cold wetness outside and the warm dryness within. "The monk's song," Aelred said as they ate, and Edmund realized that he had been humming again without conscious awareness. "You've been humming it almost continuously since the rain started." Edmund paused, listening to himself as if from a distance, and recognized the truth of her observation. "It's a song about the rain," he said slowly, the realization coming to him even as he spoke the words. "I never fully understood that before, but it's about finding peace in the water in the way that the rain brings life to the earth." Aelred smiled and reached across the table to place her hand over his. "Your father understood songs like that," she said. "He used to say that monks knew things about the rhythms of the world that other people had forgotten." That night, as Edmund lay in the darkness of the bedchamber, listening to the rain continuing to fall on the roof tiles above them, he found himself thinking about inheritance, not the inheritance of property or goods, but the inheritance of understanding, the passing down of knowledge and perception from one generation to the next. His father had taught him to listen to the hawks, to read the weather, to understand the subtle signs that indicated the proper times for action and the proper times for rest. And in turn, Edmund was teaching these things to no one. He had never had children of his own, but he was living them, embodying them, keeping them alive through the simple act of continuing to practice them with full attention and respect. The rain continued through the night and into the following day, and Edmund found that instead of frustrating him, it offered him something valuable: time to attend to the maintenance tasks that sometimes got deferred when the hunting was good. He spent the better part of the day carefully oiling and cleaning all the leather equipment, inspecting the perches for any signs of wear, and generally tending to the infrastructure of his work in a way that felt meditative and deeply satisfying. Aelred worked alongside him, and he realized once again how much of his ability to maintain his practice depended on her willingness to support it not just emotionally, but practically. She prepared the meals that sustained him. She kept the house that sheltered his hawks. She made the small offerings at the shrine that kept their community intact. Without her, his falconry would be impossible. "You're thinking about something serious," Aelred observed as they worked, setting a piece of leather aside to dry. Her 48-year-old face was observant, reading Edmund's expression with the familiarity that came from 27 years of marriage. "I'm thinking about how fortunate I am," Edmund replied. "How much of what I'm able to do depends on the care you provide." Aelred's expression softened into something tender. "And how much of what I'm able to do depends on the steadiness of your presence," she countered. "We balance each other, Edmund. That's what marriage teaches you if you're patient enough to learn it." By the third day of rain, the clouds had begun to show signs of breaking. The intensity of the downpour had lessened, becoming more intermittent, and Edmund could see patches of lighter sky appearing on the western horizon. He stood at the window of the Mews in the late afternoon, watching the weather shift, knowing that the following day would likely bring a return to conditions suitable for extended hunting. But something in Edmund felt reluctant about the return to the full rhythm of hunting. The days of the rain had given him something precious: time to be still, time to attend to maintenance, time to simply be present with Aelred and the hawks without the drive to get out into the fields. This too was valuable, he realized, this capacity to rest, to allow the work to pause and resume in its own natural rhythm. That evening, as the rain finally ceased and the stars began to appear in the clearing sky, Edmund found himself in a state of particularly deep contentment. The hawks were resting peacefully on their perches. Aelred was occupied with mending a section of torn cloth. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. And Edmund, 53 years old, felt a kind of profound gratitude for the simple fact of being alive in this moment, in this place, with these creatures and this woman who had chosen to share her life with him. The plain chant melody emerged from his lips once again, and he let it flow freely, knowing now that it contained within it all the understanding of peace and acceptance that he had spent his 53 years learning to embody. His scarred hands rested in his lap, and his heart beat with the slow, steady rhythm that had become so familiar to him over the decades. The morning that followed the rain's departure arrived crystal clear, the kind of autumn dawn that seemed to contain within it all the beauty that the season had to offer. The sky was the color of pale blue silk, and every surface that had been wet the day before now glistened, with the remnants of moisture catching the early light. Edmund, 53 years old, stood in the doorway of the Mews and breathed in air that felt cleaner somehow, purified by the passage of the rain. The hawks seemed energized by the return of clear conditions. Michael practically vibrated on his perch, eager to be released into the morning. Even Thomas, the older goshawk, seemed to have regained some of the vigor that the gray days had temporarily diminished. Only Aelred maintained her composed stillness, though Edmund could see in the brightness of her eyes that she too was ready for the day's work. Aelred appeared with the bundle of food and a small clay bottle of water as Edmund was making his final preparations. She had dressed more warmly than usual, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders, and Edmund understood immediately that she intended to accompany him to the hunting fields rather than returning to the house after delivering the provisions. "The day is too beautiful to spend indoors," she said by way of explanation, though no explanation was truly necessary. Edmund had learned long ago that Aelinar's instincts about such things were generally correct. There was a rightness to her decision to be present in the fields today, something that his 53 years of living had taught him to trust. The walk to the primary hunting field was transformed by the clear weather and the aftermath of the rain. The grass was brilliantly green, fed by the moisture that had soaked into it, and the small wildflowers that still lingered in the late season seemed to have opened more fully, as if the rain had awakened them to a final flourish of color before the winter came. Aelred walked beside Edmund, and they moved at the leisurely pace that characterized all their shared journeys. No hurry, no urgency, simply the pleasure of moving through the landscape together. "Look there," Aelred said, pointing to a section of the distant forest where a group of deer had emerged into the open. There were perhaps 6 or 7 of them, moving with that particular grace that came from generations of living in constant awareness of predators. The hawks on Edmund's arms and shoulder remained calm. They were fed, satisfied, and the work of the hunt had not yet begun, but Edmund felt a kind of recognition in watching the deer. They were, in some sense, the hawk's natural prey, though in practice, hawks hunted smaller creatures. And yet there was a connection, an acknowledgement of the relationship between predator and prey that Edmund had come to see as one of the fundamental realities of the natural world. They reached the hunting field and settled into the familiar routine. Edmund set himself up in the spot that had become almost sacred in its familiarity, a slight rise of ground that gave clear sight lines in all directions. Aelred arranged herself nearby on a low stone that had been smoothed by years of weather and use, positioning herself so that she could watch both Edmund and the sky where the hawks would soon be hunting. When Edmund released Michael into the morning, the young sparrow hawk seemed to understand that this was a day of particular possibility. He rose swiftly, his wings catching the clear light, and climbed with a kind of exuberant energy that suggested he had been restless during the days of rain. The hawk circled once, twice, 3 times, scanning the landscape for movement, for opportunity, for the small creatures that constituted his hunting grounds. The strike came suddenly, without warning, as the best strikes always did. A small finch flushed from the brush, and Michael was on it before the bird had traveled more than a few feet, moving with the perfect coordination that only a creature designed by generations of evolution for this exact purpose could achieve. The kill was clean and quick, and within moments, Michael was circling back, ready to deliver his kill to Edmund. Aelred made a small sound of satisfaction beside him, and Edmund understood that she had witnessed the same thing. He had the perfect alignment of intention and execution, the hawk doing exactly what it had been created to do. There was no cruelty in this. Edmund had long ago come to understand. There was only the expression of purpose, the unfolding of the natural order that had existed since long before humans had begun to train hawks, and would continue long after they had ceased. Aelred's hunting followed a similar pattern, the Merlin rising with composed focus, scanning the landscape, making her move with the precision that came from years of successful hunts. She took 2 kills before Edmund called her back, her movements efficient and economical, suggesting that the period of rest had not diminished her skills in any way. Thomas, the oldest of the 3, moved more slowly than the younger hawks, but his movements carried a weight of experience that was almost palpable. Edmund watched the aging goshawk work with a kind of reverence, understanding that this was a creature who had been hunting for more than 20 years, who had seen countless seasons turn from warm to cold and back again, who had survived dangers and challenges that younger hawks could barely comprehend. The older goshawk's strike was more deliberate than Michael's youthful exuberance or Aelred's composed precision. Thomas circled longer, waited more patiently, and when he finally moved, it was with the certainty of absolute confidence. His prey, a young rabbit that had ventured too far from cover, had no chance against the accumulated wisdom of the aging hawk's decades of hunting. By the time all 3 hawks had been satisfied with their kills, the sun had climbed considerably higher in the sky. Edmund and Aelred sat together on the grass, the hawks resting on their perches, and shared the simple meal that Aelred had brought. The bread was still slightly warm, the cheese was sharp and satisfying, and the water from the small stream that ran through the fields was cold and clear. "I've been thinking," Aelred said as they ate, her capable hands breaking bread into manageable pieces, "about what you said the other night, about how your work with the hawks has taught you things that your father learned and his father before him." "Yes," Edmund replied, his scarred hands similarly occupied with the food. "I was thinking about that as well, about how the understanding passes down through time, even without words being spoken. It occurs to me," Aelred continued, "that you've been doing this work for 40 years now, since you were a boy of 13. Edmund, 53 years old, nodded slowly. 40 years more than half his life spent in this precise work, this careful attention to creatures who could never truly be owned, only understood and honored. And in all that time," Aelred said, her 48-year-old face thoughtful, "you have never once spoken an unkind word to a hawk, never once moved with anger or impatience. I've watched you for 27 years, Edmund, and I have seen you maintain that same quality of attention through joy and sorrow, through good weather and bad, through times of plenty and times of scarcity." Edmund felt something move within him at these words, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition of something he had always known but never heard articulated. Aelred was right. The hawks had taught him not just about their nature, but about his own nature, about what was possible when one brought complete presence and patience to a task, regardless of the circumstances. "It's the only way I know how to be," Edmund said slowly. "My father taught me that when I was very young. He said that the hawks would know if your attention was divided, if your patience was false, if you were simply going through the motions. So there was no choice, really. The only way forward was to be genuinely present." Aelred reached over and squeezed his hand, the scarred, weathered hand of a man who had spent 53 years in careful service to wild creatures. "That's a rare gift," she said softly. "I don't think many people understand what you've accomplished, Edmund. They see the hawks and they see the hunting, but they don't see the discipline, the consistency, the way you've maintained your presence across decades." The afternoon deepened around them as they sat together in the field. Aelred eventually rose and walked back toward the house, knowing that Edmund would remain until the hawks had been properly gathered and the day's work had been completed. Edmund watched her go with a particular affection, understanding once again how much of his ability to do his work depended on her willingness to support it, to trust in its value even when it must have seemed to others that he was simply standing in a field watching birds. The gathering of the hawks followed the familiar pattern, each bird being called in and secured on its perch, rewarded with a portion of meat, and offered fresh water. Edmund moved through these actions with the automatic competence that came only from thousands of repetitions, his mind already beginning to shift toward the journey home, the evening routines, the rest that would come with nightfall. The walk back to the Mews was made in the golden light of late afternoon, the sun now clearly beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The landscape was transformed by this angle of light. Everything seemed to glow from within, and the shadows cast by the trees were long and deep, creating a patchwork of light and darkness across the fields. Edmund found himself in a state of particular peace as he walked. The day had been good. The hawks had hunted well. Aelred had been present to witness it. The weather had been favorable, and somewhere in the accumulation of these small things, his 53-year-old heart had settled into a state of contentment that seemed to deepen with each passing year. When he reached the Mews, he found Aelred waiting for him there, having prepared the space for the hawks' evening settling. Together, they moved through the familiar routines, the securing of the hawks on their perches, the offering of water, and the small comforts that made the waiting through the night bearable. Aelred's capable hands worked alongside Edmund's scarred ones, and there was a kind of grace in the way that their movements complemented each other, each person understanding what needed to be done without requiring instruction. By the time they stepped out of the Mews and moved toward the house, full darkness had arrived. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky above them, and Edmund paused for a moment to look up, to acknowledge the vast expanse of the universe that stretched above the small stone Mews and the humans who tended the hawks within it. Inside the house, Aelred had prepared a particularly nourishing meal, a thick pottage with barley and vegetables, bread with butter, and a small portion of dried fruit that represented a kind of luxury in the ordinary course of their lives. They ate together at the worn wooden table, and Edmund found himself thinking about how many meals they had shared in this space, how many conversations had taken place across this table, how much of the texture of their marriage had been woven from these quiet moments of eating and talking, and simply being present with each other. After the meal was finished and the dishes had been cleared, Aelred moved to the small window and looked out at the night. "The stars are particularly bright tonight," she observed. "It looks like there will be clear weather for several days." Edmund joined her at the window, and they stood together looking out at the landscape that was invisible in the darkness, but present nonetheless, the fields they had walked through that day, the mews where the hawks were resting, the forest beyond with its ancient trees, all of it hidden now by the night but still fundamentally there, waiting for the dawn to reveal it again. "I think," Aelred said softly, "that you have built a good life here, Edmund. Not a grand life, perhaps. Not a life that others would recognize as particularly notable or impressive, but a good life nonetheless. A life lived with attention and care and consistency." Edmund felt something settle in his chest at these words, a kind of validation, not of his external accomplishments, but of the quality of presence and intention that he had brought to his work and his life. "I couldn't have built it without you," he said simply. "Your willingness to be part of this life, your support of the work, the way you understand what matters. It has made everything possible." Aelred reached over and took his hand, and they stood together at the window, looking out at the night sky. Two people who had learned over 27 years of marriage how to be present with each other, without needing constant reassurance or emotional elaboration. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to human concerns, moving through their eternal patterns, and Edmund felt a kind of peace that transcended any particular emotion or state, a fundamental rightness about being alive in this moment, in this place, with this person beside him. When at last they turned away from the window and moved toward the stairs, Edmund's 53-year-old body settled into the familiar rhythms of preparing for sleep. His hands moved through the well-worn patterns of removing clothing and settling into bed, and Aelred's presence beside him was a comfort that had long ago ceased to require words or explanation. In the darkness, listening to Aelred's breathing gradually deepen into sleep, Edmund found himself humming very softly, not the plain chant melody that had characterized the recent days, but something different, something that seemed to emerge from the deepest parts of himself. It was a melody without words, without religious association, simply the expression of a heart that had learned over 53 years to recognize and honor the small and precious things that filled each day. Sleep came eventually, the kind of deep and restful sleep that comes only to those who have spent their day in honest work, and who carry no burden of anxiety or unresolved conflict into the night. And in his dreams, Edmund moved through fields that were both the familiar hunting grounds of his waking life and something more timeless, more eternal, a landscape where the hawks soared with perfect grace, where Aelred walked beside him with her capable hands and her steady presence, and where the work continued on, day after day, season after season, in the way that it had always continued, and would continue on into the future. Long after Edmund himself had passed beyond the boundaries of this small mews and these familiar fields. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that seemed to contain within itself all the essential elements of a life well lived. The autumn deepened around Edmund and Aelred, and the landscape began its slow transformation toward winter. The trees that bordered the hunting fields shifted from green to gold, to the deep russet colors that preceded the final shedding of leaves. The air grew cooler with each passing week, and the mornings required Edmund to wear heavier clothing as he made his way to the Mews in the pre-dawn darkness. Edmund, 53 years old, found that the changing season brought with it a kind of satisfaction that he had come to recognize over the decades. Each season had its particular character, its own lessons, its own particular beauty. Where spring brought the exuberance of new growth and summer offered the fullness of abundance, autumn gave to those who paid attention a kind of invitation to slow down, to prepare, to understand that the cycles of the year moved according to laws that no human could resist or alter. The hawks responded to the seasonal shift as they always did. Their plumage became thicker and richer. Their hunting became more intense and focused, as if they understood at some level that the time of abundance was drawing to a close and the harder months were approaching. Michael, the young sparrow hawk, seemed to mature noticeably as the weeks passed, his exuberant energy becoming channeled into increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies. Edmund watched the transformation with satisfaction, understanding that this was the natural progression of a young hawk's development. One particular morning, as Edmund was preparing the hawks for what promised to be an especially clear and favorable day, he noticed something different about Thomas, the older goshawk. The aging hawk was moving more slowly than usual, and his breathing seemed slightly labored as he shifted on his perch. Edmund, 53 years old, ran his scarred hands over the bird with the familiar expertise that came from decades of handling hawks, checking for any sign of injury or illness. He found nothing obvious: no wound, no swelling, no external sign of distress. But Edmund's instincts, honed by 53 years of life and 40 years of working with hawks, suggested that Thomas was beginning to decline. It was nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, but rather the gradual slowing that came with age, the way that even the most hardy creatures eventually began to feel the weight of years. Aelred appeared in the doorway of the Mews as Edmund was completing his examination of Thomas. She took in the situation immediately, reading Edmund's face with the familiarity that 27 years of marriage had granted her. "He's aging," Edmund said simply. There was no need for elaboration. Aelred understood the rhythms of his work as well as he did. "What will you do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "What I've always done," Edmund replied. "I'll give him the best care I can provide. I'll let him rest when rest is needed. I'll continue to hunt him as long as he's willing and able. And when the time comes—" He trailed off, but Aelred understood. They had been through this before with other hawks across the years. Death was part of the cycle, as much a part of the natural order as birth and growth and the movement of seasons. Edmund made the decision to leave Thomas behind for the day's hunting. Michael and Aelred were released into the clear autumn morning, their movements sharp and focused, eager for the hunt. Edmund and Aelred walked to the hunting fields as they had walked so many times before, and the day unfolded with its familiar pattern: the hawks rising into the sky, the prey being flushed from cover, the clean and quick strikes that marked successful hunts. But Edmund's mind was divided in a way that it rarely was. Part of his attention remained with the hawks in the field, but part of it was back at the Mews, where Thomas waited on his perch, resting through the day. This was new for Edmund, this sense of distraction, this awareness that one of his hawks was beginning to move toward the end of its life. "He's been with you a long time," Aelred said when they paused for their midday meal. She had recognized the quality of Edmund's attention without needing him to explain. 22 years, Edmund confirmed. "I trained him when he was a young bird. He was fierce then, aggressive in his hunting, full of that youthful intensity." He smiled slightly at the memory. "I remember thinking he would be one of my greatest hawks, and he was not for his fierceness, but for what he learned. He became wise, Aelred. That's the word for it. By the time he was 10 or 12 years old, he had developed a kind of wisdom that younger hawks simply don't possess." They ate their meal in contemplative silence, and when they had finished, Edmund made the decision to return to the Mews earlier than usual. Aelred gathered the hawks as they came in to be collected, and Edmund secured them on their perches with movements that were careful and deliberate, honoring each bird with particular attention. When he reached Thomas's perch, the older goshawk turned his head to look at Edmund, and something in that gaze seemed to contain a kind of understanding. Edmund placed his scarred hand very gently on the hawk's head, not gripping, not restraining, simply offering a presence, an acknowledgement. "You've done well," Edmund murmured to the bird. "All these years, all these hunts, you've been a good companion." That evening, Aelred prepared a particularly nourishing meal, as if understanding that Edmund needed not just food but comfort, not just sustenance, but acknowledgement of the particular weight that the day had brought. They sat together at the worn wooden table, and Edmund found himself telling stories about Thomas, about the first time he had hunted successfully, about a particularly remarkable hunt during a winter storm 20 years ago, about the way that the hawk had gradually become more patient and more focused as he aged. "It's strange," Edmund said, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of warm liquid, "how attached one can become to a creature that is fundamentally wild, fundamentally other. I've always told myself that the hawks are not mine, that they are simply creatures I have the privilege of working with. And that's true. And yet you love them," Aelred finished gently. "Of course you do, Edmund. How could you not? You've given them decades of your attention, your care, your respect. That creates a bond, regardless of whether the hawks can understand it in the way that humans do." The following weeks were marked by a slow and steady decline in Thomas's vitality. The aging goshawk still hunted when Edmund released him, but his flights became shorter, his enthusiasm more muted. Edmund found himself adjusting his expectations, releasing Thomas less frequently, allowing him longer periods of rest. Michael and Aelred continued their work, their hunting becoming more refined as they moved deeper into autumn. But Edmund's emotional energy was increasingly focused on the care of the aging hawk. One particularly cold morning in late autumn, Edmund arrived at the Mews to find that Thomas was struggling to maintain his perch. The aging goshawk's feet were gripping the wood with obvious effort, and his breathing was labored. Edmund, 53 years old, understood immediately that this was the beginning of the end, though the actual moment might still be days or weeks away. He approached Thomas with movements slow and gentle, offering no pressure, simply presence. The older goshawk turned his head one final time to look at Edmund, and in that gaze was a kind of resignation, an acknowledgement that the body was failing, that the time of hunting and flying was drawing to its close. "You can rest now," Edmund said softly, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the Mews. "You've earned that rest. All those years of work, all those hunts, you can rest." Thomas did rest, that day and the next and the next. Edmund continued to offer water and food, though the aging hawk ate little, his body gradually consuming itself as it approached the end. Aelred assisted Edmund in keeping Thomas comfortable, helping to adjust his perch to positions that seemed to cause less strain, maintaining the space around him with the kind of meticulous cleanliness that prevented infection and provided what small comfort was possible. It was on a gray November morning, with the first real snow of the season falling lightly outside the Mews, that Edmund arrived to find Thomas had passed away sometime during the night. The aging goshawk was still perched on his familiar spot, his body cooled now, but his expression peaceful, as if the act of dying had finally released him from the burden of maintaining his grip on life. Edmund stood for a long time simply looking at the bird. No tears came. Edmund was not a man who cried easily, but something deep within him felt the weight of the loss. 22 years, a quarter of his life had been spent working with this hawk, learning from him, being taught by him the lessons that only wild creatures could teach. Aelred appeared in the doorway, having seen Edmund's stillness, and understood without words what had occurred. She came and stood beside her husband, and together they looked at the body of the hawk that had been part of their lives for more than 2 decades. "He lived a good life," Aelred said softly. "A long life for a hawk, a life filled with hunting and flying and the kind of attention that you gave to him." Edmund, 53 years old, nodded slowly. "My father had a hawk once," he said, his voice distant, remembering. "A goshawk named Gabriel, like the angel. My father kept him for 32 years until the hawk was older than I am now. My father said that Gabriel was his greatest teacher, that every moment spent with Gabriel was a moment spent in direct contact with something fundamental about the nature of life and death, and the cycles that governed all creatures." Edmund made the decision to bury Thomas in a small spot near the Mews, a place where the hawk could rest beneath the earth that he had hunted above for so many years. He dug the grave himself, working through the November cold, his scarred hands moving the earth with the same careful attention that he brought to all his work. Aelred brought a cloth to wrap the hawk's body, and together they placed Thomas in the ground with a kind of ceremony that required no words, only presence and respect. Edmund placed a smooth stone at the head of the grave, a marker that would weather the passage of seasons but would remain, a small acknowledgement that this creature had existed, had mattered, had been worthy of remembrance. The weeks that followed were different in a way that Edmund had not anticipated. The loss of Thomas was not debilitating. Edmund had known from the beginning that the hawk would eventually die, that all creatures lived within the boundaries of finite time. But the absence of the aging goshawk's presence in the Mews created a kind of silence that required adjustment. Michael and Aelred continued their hunting with undiminished vigor, and Edmund found that their work demanded his full attention once again. But there was something different in the quality of his attention, now a kind of deepening awareness that each moment with his hawks was precious precisely because it was temporary, because the future was unknown, because death was waiting somewhere beyond the horizon for all creatures, wild and human alike. One evening, as Edmund and Aelred sat by the fire, Aelred spoke of something that had been on her mind. "I've been thinking about what will happen," she said carefully, "when you can no longer do this work, when age or illness prevents you from spending your days in the fields with the hawks." Edmund, 53 years old, turned to look at his wife. He had not consciously considered this question, though it was present somewhere in the background of his awareness. The knowledge that his 53 years could not continue indefinitely, that eventually his scarred hands would become too stiff, his body too weary for the work. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent my entire life doing this. I'm not sure who I would be if I couldn't." "Perhaps," Aelred suggested gently, "that's something you might want to think about. Not in a way that causes anxiety, but simply as a recognition that seasons change for humans as well as for hawks, and for the year itself." Edmund sat with this observation, understanding its wisdom, understanding that Aelred was not trying to diminish his work, but rather to invite him to consider the larger arc of his life, the way that even the most meaningful work eventually gave way to other forms of meaning. That night, as Edmund lay in the darkness, he found himself thinking about his father, dead now for 12 years. His father had continued hunting hawks almost until the very end of his life. But there had come a time, Edmund recalled, when the older man had begun to step back, to allow Edmund to take on more of the work, to entrust his beloved hawks to his son's care. Perhaps that was what lay ahead for Edmund as well, not an ending, but a transformation, a shift from being the primary actor in this work to being something else, something like a witness or a guardian of understanding, rather than a direct participant in the daily hunting. But that lay in the future, and Edmund had learned long ago that the future was best approached by being fully present in the present. And so, on the mornings that followed Thomas's death, Edmund rose before dawn and made his way to the Mews to tend to Michael and Aelred, to offer them their preparation for the day's hunting, to bring to this work the same quality of attention that had characterized his life for 53 years. The snow deepened as November gave way to December, and the hunting became more challenging, more focused. Edmund and Aelred's lives began to take on the particular character that came with the approach of winter preparations for the cold months, the gathering and storing of food, the tending of fires, the slow settling into the more interior quality of life that the dark season required. Winter arrived with a kind of inevitability that Edmund had come to expect, and even welcome over his 53 years. The snow that had begun falling in late November deepened and persisted, transforming the landscape into something fundamentally different from what it had been in autumn. The fields that Edmund hunted across became white and undulating, the visibility reduced, the challenges of the work magnified. Yet there was something about winter hunting that Edmund had always found particularly satisfying. The hawks seemed to understand that the season required greater focus, greater determination. The prey was less abundant, more difficult to flush from cover, more desperate in its attempts to survive. The hunts became exercises in patience and precision, stripped of all unnecessary complexity, reduced to their fundamental essence: the predator, the prey, the hunter, and the moment of connection when all elements aligned. Michael and Aelred both responded to the winter conditions with a kind of intensity that suggested they were entering their truest season. The young sparrow hawk's movements became more economical, his flights more purposeful. The merlin's hunts took on an almost meditative quality, as if she were moving through a familiar ritual that she understood at the deepest level of her being. Edmund, 53 years old, found himself spending longer hours in the hunting fields, moving more slowly through the snow, allowing the cold to settle into his bones without resistance. His scarred hands grew chapped and raw despite the leather gloves he wore, and his face became weathered further by the wind that carried snow and ice across the open landscape. But there was no complaint in him about these physical discomforts. Rather, he accepted them as part of the work, as part of what was required to maintain his presence with the hawks during the most demanding season of the year. Aelred worried about him in a way that was both evident and never directly expressed. She would prepare extra warming meals, adding more fat and more meat than the usual simple fare. She would insist that Edmund spend time by the fire in the evening, warming his hands and his body before the night's sleep. And she would sometimes accompany him to the hunting fields even in conditions that were genuinely difficult. Her presence, a kind of quiet support that Edmund understood and appreciated, without needing to acknowledge directly. One particularly bitter morning, with the temperature so cold that breath froze almost instantly into crystals in the air, Edmund found Aelred waiting for him at the door of the Mews. She was dressed for the cold in the heaviest clothing she possessed, and she carried with her a small bundle containing heated stones wrapped in clotha preparation that would provide some comfort if the day became too difficult. "I'm coming with you today," she announced, and it was not a request but a statement of fact. Edmund, 53 years old, recognized the particular tone in her voice that meant her decision was non-negotiable. He simply nodded and prepared the hawks with Aelred's assistance. The walk to the hunting fields that morning was made in almost complete silence, the cold seeming to press around them so heavily that even speech felt like too much effort. The landscape was transformed by the previous night's snowfall. Everything was white and undulating, the familiar terrain rendered strange and new by the accumulation of ice and snow. They reached the primary hunting field and Edmund went through his familiar preparations, his movements precise despite the cold that made every muscle stiff and reluctant. When he released Michael into the white morning, the young sparrow hawk rose quickly, as if eager to escape the weight of the cold air near the ground. The hawk climbed and climbed, becoming smaller and smaller against the pale sky, until Edmund could barely track his movement. The hunt that followed was swift and clean. Michael found prey quickly, made his strike with perfect accuracy, and returned to Edmund's wrist with the catch still clutched in his talons. Aelred watched from her position nearby, and Edmund could see in her expression a kind of satisfaction at the sight of the young hawk's success. Aelred's hunting took longer. The merlins circled for what seemed like an extended period, scanning the snow-covered landscape, searching for movement that would indicate the presence of prey. Aelred and Edmund waited together, and Edmund found himself appreciating her presence in a way that transcended explanation. There was something about having a witness to this work, someone who understood its value and its demands, that deepened the experience itself. When Aelred finally made her move, it was with decisive precision. The hunt was brief and successful, and the Merlin returned with her catch, ready for the reward that Edmund provided from the leather pouch at his waist. By midday, both hawks had fed well, and Edmund made the decision to begin the journey back to the Mews. Aelred had brought food for them as well as for the hawks, and they consumed a simple meal of bread and cheese while sitting on a low stone wall, protected somewhat from the direct wind by a slight rise in the landscape. "Your father would be proud," Aelred said, her capable hands breaking bread into smaller pieces. "Doing this work in conditions like this, most people would have stayed inside by the fire." "My father did this," Edmund replied, his scarred hands similarly occupied. "Through winters that were worse than this sometimes. He taught me that the hawks don't cease to need hunting simply because the weather is difficult. If anything, they need it more in winter. The prey is harder to find. The energy they expend is greater. The need to hunt is more fundamental." "And yet," Aelred observed, "there's a difference between doing what's necessary and doing it with the kind of care and attention that you bring to it. Any falconer might hunt in winter, but not every falconer would maintain that quality of presence through the cold, and would continue to treat the hawks with that same respect and gentleness that characterizes your work in summer." Edmund felt something shift in his chest at these words of recognition, that Aelred was seeing something in his work that went deeper than the surface level of hunting and training. She was recognizing, he realized, the spiritual dimension of what he did, the way that the work of falconry had become for him a kind of practice, a kind of meditation on presence and attention, and the connection between human and wild creature. The return journey to the Mews was made in the fading light of the early winter afternoon. The sun, such as it was, seemed to provide very little warmth, and the shadows cast by the scattered trees grew longer and deeper as they walked. By the time they reached the Mews, full darkness was approaching, and Edmund and Aelred moved quickly through the evening routines, securing the hawks on their perches, providing fresh water, ensuring that all was comfortable and secure for the night ahead. Inside the house, Aelred had prepared a particularly warming meal, thick stew with vegetables and meat, bread still warm from the oven, ale heated with spices. They ate together in the warmth of the kitchen, and Edmund felt the cold gradually releasing its grip on his body, warmth seeping back into his joints and his muscles. "I want to ask you something," Aelred said as they finished their meal. "Something that I've been thinking about since we spoke about the future, about what will happen when you can no longer do this work." Edmund set down his cup and gave Aelred his full attention. At 53 years old, with 27 years of marriage behind them, he had learned to recognize when his wife had something important to share. "I want to know," Aelred continued carefully, "whether you would consider taking on an apprentice. Someone from the village, perhaps, who could learn your work and eventually carry it forward. Not to replace you, that would be impossible, but to continue what you've started, to preserve the knowledge that you've accumulated over 53 years? Edmund had not anticipated this question, and he found himself considering it carefully. The idea of teaching another person the intricacies of falconry, of sharing the work that had defined his entire life, carried with it both appeal and a kind of reluctance that surprised him. "I would need to think about it," he said finally. "The work requires a particular kind of temperament, patience, respect, the willingness to be present without needing immediate results or external validation. I'm not sure those qualities are common." "Perhaps not," Aelred agreed. "But there's a boy in the village, the one who asked you about the hawks hunting us a few months ago. I've noticed him watching you sometimes when you pass through. There's something in his expression that suggests he understands, or at least wants to understand." Edmund remembered the boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with curious eyes and that particular openness that only children possessed. "He's very young," Edmund observed. "He is," Aelred acknowledged. "But you were 13 when your father began teaching you seriously. In 5 or 6 years, he would be old enough to begin an apprenticeship. By then, you would have had time to consider whether you wished to take on a student." Edmund sat with this thought as the evening deepened around them. The idea of teaching another person, of transmitting the accumulated knowledge of his 53 years to someone else, carried with it a weight of responsibility that he had not anticipated. And yet, Aelred was right that the knowledge he possessed would be lost when he eventually passed beyond the boundaries of this world, unless it was passed on to someone else who cared enough to receive it, to respect it, to maintain it. That night, as Edmund lay in the darkness of the bedchamber, listening to Aelred's breathing gradually deepen into sleep, he found himself thinking about continuity, about the way that knowledge and understanding could persist through time, moving from one generation to the next, like a river flowing from its source toward the distant sea. His father had taught him. His father had learned from his own father. And somewhere in the distant past, the first person to train a hawk had learned through observation and trial, through the kind of experimentation that eventually developed into the sophisticated understanding that Edmund now possessed. The question was whether this chain of understanding would continue, whether Edmund would actively choose to become a teacher as well as a practitioner of his craft, or whether, at his death, this knowledge would largely die with him, preserved only in the hawks themselves and the particular way they had been shaped by his training. It was not a decision that required an immediate answer, Edmund recognized. There was still time. Winter would pass, spring would come, the cycles would continue their eternal turning. And in that time, Edmund could consider what Aelred had suggested, could begin to observe the boy more carefully, could determine whether there was indeed something in him that suggested a capacity to understand the work. But as Edmund drifted toward sleep, he found himself humming very softly not the plain chant melody that had become so familiar, but something new, something that seemed to emerge from the recognition that his life, which had always seemed to him like a kind of isolated practice, might actually be part of something larger, something that extended beyond his individual existence into a future that would continue on after he himself had passed beyond the boundaries of this world. The days that followed continued in much the same pattern as the winter deepened. Edmund rose before dawn, attended to the hawks, moved through the hunting in conditions that grew increasingly severe as December progressed toward the solstice. The shortest day of the year arrived with a kind of quiet intensity, and Edmund found himself thinking about cycles, about the way that the darkest day was also the day that promised the return of light. He began to observe the boy from the village more carefully, noticing the way that the young creature moved, the particular quality of his attention when he watched Edmund working with the hawks. There was indeed something there, a kind of openness, a willingness to see beyond the surface of things, a recognition that there were ways of being in the world that transcended the ordinary concerns of village life. One afternoon, as Edmund was returning from the hunting fields, he paused at a spot where the boy was playing and called him over. "What's your name?" Edmund asked, his 53-year-old voice quiet and direct. "Robert, sir," the boy replied, his young eyes bright with the particular mixture of fear and excitement that children experienced when an adult singled them out for attention. "Robert," Edmund repeated, as if placing the name in his memory. "I've noticed you watching sometimes. Are you interested in hawks?" The boy nodded eagerly. "I think they're beautiful," he said. "The way they fly, the way they hunt, it seems important somehow." Edmund felt something shift in his chest at these words, a recognition that Aelred had been right, that there was indeed something in this boy that suggested a capacity to understand, to develop, to eventually become worthy of receiving the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of work. "Perhaps," Edmund said slowly, "we could talk sometime about hawks, about the work of training them, not now you're still young, but in a few years if you remain interested, if you develop the patience and the respect that the work requires, perhaps I could teach you." The boy's expression transformed into something luminous. "Really?" he asked, scarcely able to contain his excitement. "Really," Edmund confirmed. "But you must understand this is not a game. This is serious work. It requires consistency, attention, and the willingness to care for creatures that can never be fully owned, only respected and understood. Can you do that?" "Yes," the boy said immediately without hesitation. "Yes, I can, I will." Edmund placed his scarred hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment, and in that gesture was a kind of blessing, a recognition that something was being set in motion, that the knowledge and understanding that had shaped Edmund's entire life would indeed continue forward, would be transmitted to this young creature who possessed the openness and the inclination to receive it. That evening, Edmund told Aelred what had occurred. "You've begun already," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "By offering the possibility, you've begun the process of teaching him the most important lesson, that the work is worth undertaking, that there is value in dedicating oneself to something that requires patience and respect." Edmund, 53 years old, found himself nodding in recognition of the wisdom of her observation. And as the winter deepened around them, as the snow continued to fall, and the cold pressed in on the small stone house, and the mews where the hawks waited for the hunting days, Edmund felt something settle within him, a sense of rightness, of purpose extending beyond his individual life, of being part of a continuity that would persist through this boy and others who might come after, into a future that Edmund himself would never see. The winter solstice passed, and the light began its slow return to the world. The days remained cold and brief, but there was a subtle shift in the quality of the daylight, a promise that somewhere, beyond the reach of the current season, warmth and longer days were waiting. Edmund, 53 years old, felt this shift in his body, in the particular awareness that came from 53 years of living in close attention to the natural cycles that governed all creatures. The boy, Robert, began to appear more frequently near the news as the weeks progressed into the new year. He would come in the late afternoons, after his other duties were completed, and simply watch as Edmund attended to the hawks. There was no instruction yet, no formal teaching. Edmund had been clear that the boy was too young for that, but there was observation, and observation was the foundation upon which all true learning was built. Edmund found himself adjusting his work slightly, becoming more conscious of what he was doing, more attentive to explaining the small actions that had long ago become automatic. He would pause and point out the particular way that a hawk's jesses needed to be fastened, or the significance of the subtle shift in a bird's body position that indicated stress or contentment. Robert absorbed these small lessons with a kind of focused attention that reminded Edmund of his own childhood, of the way that his father had taught him, not through formal instruction, but through the simple act of allowing Edmund to be present while work was being done. Aelred observed this development with quiet satisfaction. She began to include Robert in small tasks around the house, and the Mews bringing water for the hawks, helping to gather supplies, learning the practical rhythms of maintaining a falconry operation. The boy proved to be capable and willing, never complaining about the work, always eager to be helpful. One particular afternoon in January, as Edmund was examining Aelred's wing feathers for any signs of damage from the previous day's hunting, Robert asked a question that suggested the depth of his thinking about the work. "Why do you care for them so much?" the boy asked. "The hawks, I mean, they're wild creatures, they could hurt you, and yet you spend all your time making sure they're comfortable and safe." Edmund paused in his examination and considered the question carefully. It was not a simple question, and it deserved more than a simple answer. "Because," Edmund said slowly, his scarred hands continuing their gentle work on Aelred's feathers, "the hawks are teachers. They teach us about presence, about attention, about the way that respect and consistency can create a kind of understanding between creatures that are fundamentally different from each other. When you care for something, truly care for it, with your whole being, you learn things about yourself and about the world that you could never learn any other way." Robert considered this answer, and Edmund could see the boy thinking, turning the words over in his young mind, trying to comprehend something that transcended his current experience. "And," Edmund continued, "there is something about the act of caring itself that is valuable, not because it leads to any particular outcome or reward, but because the act of caring, done with consistency and respect, is itself a form of prayer, a way of acknowledging the sacred in all creatures." The boy nodded slowly, and Edmund understood that Robert had not fully comprehended this teaching, but he had received it, had taken it into himself in a way that would continue to develop and deepen, as he grew older and brought more of his own experience to bear on the words. As January progressed, Edmund began to include Robert in some of the actual work with the hawks, nothing demanding, simply holding a perch steady while Edmund worked with the leather equipment, or helping to prepare the food that would be used as rewards during training sessions. Robert moved through these tasks with a carefulness and respect that suggested he understood at some level that he was being trusted with something important. One morning, as Edmund and Robert were working together in the Mews, Aelred appeared in the doorway with a visitor, a man from the village whom Edmund recognized, but did not know well. The man was perhaps 60 years old, with gray-streaked hair and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent much of his life outdoors. "Edmund," Aelred said, "this is Martin. He came to the house asking about you. He has something to tell you." Edmund set aside the equipment he had been working with and turned to face the stranger. There was something in the man's expression that suggested both gravity and a kind of tentative hope. "I've heard you have hawks," Martin said without preamble, "that you train them and that you're skilled at it. I've come to ask if you might be willing to help me with something. My grandson, he was born 3 months ago, and the healers tell us that his lungs are weak, that he may not survive the winter. His mother, my daughter, is. She's having difficulty accepting this possibility. I wondered if—" Martin trailed off, and Edmund waited, understanding that the man was struggling to articulate something that was difficult and painful. "I wondered if there might be something about your work with the hawks that could comfort her," Martin continued finally. "Some understanding about acceptance, about the natural cycles of life and death. I don't know exactly what I'm asking for, but I know that my daughter respects you, that she's seen you around the village with your birds. I thought perhaps—" Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of a kind of request that transcended the ordinary boundaries of his work. He was being asked, in effect, to offer not just his knowledge of hawks, but some kind of wisdom about how to live in the face of loss and uncertainty. "Tell me about your daughter," Edmund said, gesturing for Martin to follow him out of the Mews. Aelred and Robert remained behind, giving them privacy for what Edmund sensed would be a significant conversation. They walked together across the snowy landscape, and Martin told Edmund about his daughter, about her love for her newborn son, about the particular agony of being told that the child might not survive. Edmund listened without interrupting, offering only his presence and his attention. When Martin finished speaking, Edmund was silent for a long moment, considering how to respond to this request. "I cannot prevent your grandson from dying," Edmund said finally, his 53-year-old voice quiet but steady. "I have no power to change that outcome if that is what lies ahead, but I can tell you something about what I have learned from the hawks, something that might offer your daughter some comfort." They stopped walking, and Edmund turned to face Martin directly. "When a creature is dying, whether it is a hawk or a human, the most important thing is presence," Edmund said. "To be there fully, without wishing that things were different, without trying to change what is. The hawks have taught me that death is not an evil or a failure. It is simply part of the cycle, part of the natural order that governs all living things. And the way that we meet death, the quality of presence we bring to that final passage, matters more than we usually understand. Martin's eyes had filled with tears, and Edmund understood that he had touched something true, something that resonated with the man's deepest understanding. "If your daughter wishes to speak with me," Edmund continued, "I would be willing to receive her, not to offer false hope or comfort, but simply to share what I have learned about presence and about the way that love and acceptance can exist together, even in the face of loss." Martin thanked Edmund with evident gratitude, and the two men stood together in the cold afternoon, two creatures acknowledging the deep and universal reality that bound all humans together, the knowledge that those we love would eventually die, and the question of how to live meaningfully in the face of that knowledge. Over the following weeks, Martin's daughter, whose name was Catherine, began to visit Edmund at the Mews. She would come in the late afternoons after she had tended to her newborn son, and she would simply watch as Edmund worked with the hawks. There was no formal conversation, no explicit teaching. Rather, there was the simple sharing of presence, the acknowledgement that Edmund understood something about loss and care, and the continuation of life in the face of death. Edmund found that his usual work with the hawks took on a new dimension in the presence of Catherine's grief. The careful attention he brought to each hawk's needs, the consistency and respect that characterized his handling of each creature, became a kind of wordless teaching for Catherine about how to be with her dying son. He could see it in the shift of her expression, the way that watching Edmund's work seemed to offer her some kind of permission to simply be present with her child, without needing to change or fix anything. Robert, who continued to come to the Mews in the afternoons, seemed to understand intuitively that something significant was happening. The boy, now 8 years old, adjusted his own behavior to be less exuberant, more contemplative, offering Catherine quiet respect without needing to be instructed to do so. One particularly clear afternoon in late January, as Edmund was preparing Michael for a day of hunting, Catherine asked him a question. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you accept loss so calmly? I've seen you with the older hawk, the one that died recently, and I can tell that you grieved, but you also seem at peace with it." Edmund, his scarred hands continuing their work, took a moment before responding. "I'm not sure I can accept it calmly," he said finally. "I think what I do is accept that loss is part of life, that grief and joy are bound together in a way that cannot be separated. When I lost Thomas, the older goshawk, I was sad, but I was also grateful for the 22 years that I had with him, grateful for all the things he taught me, grateful that he lived a good life, and that when the time came, he was able to go peacefully." He paused and then added, "It's the same with your son, perhaps. I cannot tell you that it will be easy or that the grief will disappear, but I can tell you that the love you have for him and the presence you bring to his life, even if it is brief, matters more than you can possibly understand. And that will be a kind of comfort, even in the face of loss." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were not entirely tears of sorrow. Edmund understood that he had offered her something she needed, not false hope, but a kind of permission to grieve and love simultaneously, to accept that her son's life, however brief, was valuable and meaningful. The days continued their slow progression towards spring. Edmund's 53-year-old body adapted to the rhythm of winter hunting. His scarred hands became more weathered, but his spirit seemed to deepen and strengthen with each passing day. Michael and Aelred continued their work, their hunts becoming more successful as the winter advanced, and Edmund's understanding of their particular temperaments and preferences became ever more refined. And then, on a gray morning in early February, Martin appeared at the Mews with news. His grandson had passed away peacefully, his mother at his side, and the child had been buried in the small churchyard with the village gathered in witness. Catherine, Martin reported, was grieving deeply, but there was also something in her that seemed to have found a kind of acceptance, a recognition that her son had lived and been loved, and that this was enough. Edmund received this news with the particular kind of sorrow that comes when one has been present to another person's pain. He said nothing in response, but he understood that he had been given the privilege of witnessing something sacred, the way that presence and respect could offer comfort in the face of loss, the way that the simple act of bearing witness could transform grief into something that could be carried, if not overcome. That evening, as Edmund told Aelred about the child's passing, he found himself thinking about his own life, about the way that his work with the hawks had prepared him for this particular role, not as a healer or a counselor, but as someone who understood, through decades of experience with creatures that could not speak, something about the acceptance of what is, the surrender to cycles beyond human control. "You're becoming a teacher," Aelred observed as they prepared for sleep. "Not just to Robert, but to others as well. People are beginning to understand that what you know is valuable, not just about hawks, but about how to live." Edmund, 53 years old, considered this observation. He had never thought of himself as a teacher in any formal sense. He simply did his work, brought his attention to his hawks, and lived according to the principles that 53 years of presence had taught him. And yet, Aelred was right somehow. In the simple act of continuing to do this work with full attention, he had become a teacher, offering lessons to anyone who cared enough to observe. The winter continued, but something had shifted. Edmund's life, which had always seemed to him like a kind of isolated practice, had begun to intersect with the larger community in new ways. Robert continued to learn the basics of falconry. Catherine's visits became less frequent as her grief began to transform into acceptance, but her gratitude remained present in the respectful way she greeted Edmund when their paths crossed in the village. And Edmund found that his work with the hawks took on new dimensions, that the practice that had defined his entire life was revealing deeper layers of meaning that he was only now beginning to understand. The hawks were still his primary teachers, but they were no longer his only students. His presence, his attention, his willingness to bring respect and care to all creatures and all moments had become a gift that he was offering to the world, simply by continuing to do his work with integrity and love. The winter that had defined so much of Edmund's year began at last to release its grip on the land. The snow that had accumulated through the long, dark months started to recede, becoming patchy and weak, revealing the brown earth beneath. The days grew noticeably longer, and the quality of light began to shift from the harsh brightness of winter to something warmer, more generous, carrying within it the promise of spring. Edmund, 53 years old, felt the seasonal transition in his bones and in his spirit. The hawk sensed it as well. Michael's hunting became more exuberant, Aelred's movements more fluid and assured, as if both birds understood that the most challenging season had passed and the world was preparing itself for renewal. On a clear afternoon in early March, with the first real warmth of the approaching season touching the landscape, Edmund walked with Aelred to the small plot of earth where Thomas lay buried. The stone marker that Edmund had placed there in November was still visible, worn slightly by the passage of months but still standing, still marking the place where the aging goshawk had been laid to rest. Aelred carried with her a small bundle of dried herbs, rosemary and lavender, plants that Aelred had gathered and preserved from her garden the previous autumn. She scattered them gently across the grave, and the scent rose with the warmth of the afternoon, filling the air with a fragrance that spoke of memory and respect, and the continuation of care even beyond death. "He was a good hawk," Aelred said softly, looking down at the stone marker. "And you were a good teacher to him, Edmund. You gave him a life worth living." Edmund, his scarred hands resting at his sides, felt the weight of these words settle into him. "He taught me more than I taught him," he replied. "By the end, I think we both understood that. The older he became, the more I learned from simply watching him, from understanding the way that age brings its own particular wisdom." They stood together in silence for a long moment, two people who had built a life together on the foundation of respect and presence, acknowledging the death of a creature that had been part of their shared existence for more than 2 decades. As they turned to walk back toward the house, Edmund found himself thinking about how strange it was that 53 years could pass in what seemed like a single breath, that decades of consistent work could accumulate into a kind of life that transcended any individual moment or achievement. His father had lived to be 71 years old. Edmund recalled 18 more years than he had yet lived. The prospect of those additional years seemed both vast and strangely immediate. That evening, as Aelred prepared the evening meal and Edmund sat by the window of the kitchen, watching the light fade from the sky, Robert appeared at the door. The boy, now 8 years old, had become a fixture in Edmund's life, visiting the Mews nearly every day after his other duties were completed. There was a particular expression on Robert's face that suggested he had something he wished to discuss. "My father says that I'm old enough now," Robert announced without preamble, his young voice carrying a kind of formal seriousness. "He says that if you're still willing, I could begin to apprentice with you. Properly, I mean. Not just watching, but actually learning the work." Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the future he and Aelred had discussed was beginning to arrive, that the knowledge and understanding he had accumulated across 53 years would indeed be transmitted to another person, would continue forward into a future that Edmund himself would never see. "Yes," Edmund said simply, "I think you're ready to begin, but you must understand that this is a commitment. It will require patience, consistency, and the willingness to bring your full attention to work that sometimes feels repetitive and unrewarding. Can you do that?" "Yes," Robert said with the kind of absolute certainty that only a child could possess. "I can, I will." Aelred smiled from where she stood tending the fire, and Edmund understood that she had anticipated this moment, had perhaps even helped to arrange it through her conversations with Robert's family. The days that followed marked a subtle but significant shift in the rhythms of Edmund's life. The work with the hawks remained fundamentally unchanged: the daily preparation, the hunting, the careful maintenance of equipment and space. But now, Edmund found himself explaining each action to Robert, breaking down movements that had become automatic into their component parts, articulating understanding that had long ago ceased to require conscious thought. It was more difficult than Edmund had anticipated. The language required to explain why a particular motion was better than another, why respect mattered more than skill, why patience was the truest measure of a falconer's competence. This language did not come easily to him. Edmund had spent his life communicating with hawks through gesture and tone and presence, not through words. But he began to find the words, to develop a kind of teaching language that could convey something of what he understood. Robert proved to be an apt student. The boy's natural inclinations were toward observation and carefulness rather than action and boldness, which Edmund recognized as ideal characteristics for someone learning to work with hawks. Robert would watch Edmund's hands moving through the familiar motions, and then he would carefully replicate those movements himself, never rushing, never trying to take shortcuts or speed up processes that required time. One afternoon in late March, as Edmund was demonstrating how to properly fit a hood onto a hawk, Robert asked a question that revealed the depth of the boy's thinking about the work. "When the hawk gets older," Robert asked, "does it become wiser, like people do?" Edmund paused in his demonstration and considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally, "hawks become wiser in their own way. They learn which hunting grounds are most productive, which times of day are best for different kinds of prey, how to conserve energy, and when to use their full strength. And they learn to trust their trainer more fully, to understand that the relationship is reliable and safe." "Is that why you were so sad when Thomas died?" Robert asked. "Because he was wise." Edmund felt something catch in his throat at the directness of the boy's observation. "Yes," he admitted, "that's part of it, but also because I had spent 22 years with him. I had watched him change and grow and become who he was. And when that ends, there's a particular kind of loss that cannot be easily described in words." Robert nodded as if this explanation made sense to him, as if he could already anticipate, at his young age, the way that time and presence and consistency could create bonds that transcended the ordinary boundaries between species and between conscious and preconscious understanding. As spring advanced toward summer, the landscape underwent its annual transformation. The snow receded entirely, the grass returned to its green vitality, and the trees that bordered Edmund's property burst into leaf with a kind of exuberant energy that seemed to fill the world with light and possibility. The hunting season remained productive, and Edmund found that his 53-year-old body, which had felt the weight of the winter quite keenly, began to recover some of its vigor and resilience. Aelred, observing Edmund's renewed energy and the particular satisfaction that came from teaching Robert, smiled with a kind of knowing contentment. She had anticipated, it seemed, that this expansion of Edmund's work, this shift from being a sole practitioner to becoming a teacher, would, offer him a new dimension of purpose and meaning. One evening in late spring, as Edmund sat by the window watching the sun's slow descent toward the western hills, Aelred placed her hand on his shoulder. "You've built something that will outlive you," she said softly. "That's a rare and precious thing. Not many people are given the opportunity to see their life's work being carried forward by another." Edmund reached up and took Aelred's hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her touch. "I couldn't have done any of it without you," he said, as he had said many times before and would say many times again. "The hawks, the teaching, the way I've been able to bring my full attention to this work, all of it depends on the foundation that you've provided." Aelred squeezed his hand gently and did not respond with words. They stood together at the window, watching the light change as the sun descended. Two people who had learned over 27 years that some things needed no words. That presence itself was a kind of communication more profound than any speech could achieve. The sun touched the distant hills and began to sink below them, leaving behind a trail of color gold and orange and deep crimson that seemed to contain within itself the accumulated beauty of the entire year. Edmund watched this daily miracle with the same kind of attention that he brought to all things, understanding that this moment would never come again exactly as it was coming now, that each sunset was unique and irreplaceable and worthy of full presence. In the Mews, the hawks rested on their perches, their day's hunting completed, their bodies settling into the particular peace that came with rest well earned. Robert had returned to his family's home, but he would return tomorrow, and the day after that, continuing the apprenticeship that would eventually allow him to become a falconer in his own right, to carry forward the understanding that Edmund had accumulated across 53 years and 4 decades of dedicated work. And Edmund, 53 years old, with his scarred hands and his weathered face and his deep contentment that had become the baseline of his emotional life, stood with his wife at the window and watched the light fade from the world, understanding that he was part of something that transcended his individual life, something that had extended backward through time from his father and his father's father, and would extend forward through Robert and those who might come after Robert, continuing on, generation after generation, as long as there were hawks to train and people willing to bring their full attention and respect to the ancient work of falconry. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Edmund felt Aelred's presence beside him like a kind of anchor, a reminder that he was not alone in this life, that the love and support of another person could transform solitary work into something shared and meaningful. The night deepened around them, but there was no darkness in it, only the particular peace that comes when one has spent a day in honest work, when one has been present to the moments that make up a life, when one has brought care and respect to all creatures and all moments. And in this peace, in this recognition of a life well lived, in the knowledge that the work would continue forward into futures he would never see, Edmund found a contentment that transcended any particular emotion or event, a recognition of the sacred in the simple and the ordinary, a gratitude for having been given the privilege of existing, of working, of loving, and of being loved in return. The Mews stood quiet in the darkness beyond the window, holding within it the hawks that Edmund had trained, each one a teacher, each one a gift, each one a small point of light in a world that sometimes seemed too large and too complicated for any one person to truly comprehend. But Edmund had learned, across 53 years and 4 decades of work, that understanding did not require comprehending the whole. Understanding could come from simply being fully present to one small thing: a hawk on a gloved wrist, a wife's hand in the darkness, the ancient cycle of hunting and resting that had continued since before humans had ever walked the earth. And this was enough. It had always been enough. It would continue to be enough, as long as the hawks flew and the seasons turned, and there were hands willing to serve them with respect and care, and the kind of presence that transformed ordinary moments into something sacred.